Hello everybody, welcome back to Tom Reads Things. My name is Tom. I hope you're all having a wonderful Sunday. It's so nice, such nice weather in the UK. We've had some really good couple of weeks of sunshine, which we don't usually get. Everyone always thinks that the UK is really rubbish when it comes to weather, and it is a lot of the time. But we've had some really nice weather recently. So yeah, very much enjoying it. I'm going to get out in the garden today with Mark and my father-in-law, or should I just sit and read instead? Let me know what you think. I'd probably prefer just to sit and read. Okay, so I haven't done a video in a while. Reason being, I've been really busy. So I had a week in London for work. And work has just been really kind of full on at the moment, so I haven't had a huge amount of time to read. But what I have been reading has been excellent. I've been really enjoying. What I thought I would do today is my kind of May wrap up. And the number of books that I read in May is, get ready for it, drum roll please, 2 books. Yes, 2 books. Well done me. So yeah, I only read 2 books in May. As I said, it's been a really busy month. And if you follow me on Instagram, you'll have seen that when I'm feeling quite kind of stressed and under pressure and stuff, I tend not to read because there's kind of too much going on in my mind and I can't concentrate on the book. So that's kind of where I've been. Plus, one of the books was a classic, and it's very small writing, and it was quite long, and it took me a while to get through. That's my excuse anyway. So before I get into the 2 books that I read in the month of May, I thought it would be good to talk to you about another book that I read previously a couple of months back and didn't actually talk about on my channel, but really enjoyed. And that book is My Policeman by Bethan Roberts. So I heard about this book through Simon at Savage Reads, and actually this is the first of 2 books that I'm going to talk about that Simon has spoken about on his channel and really enjoyed and really liked. And I know I'm always talking about the recommendations and stuff I've got from Simon's channel on here, but I think, you know, if you pick up a book because of another booktuber and you really like it, or even if you don't like it and then you're going to talk about it, I think it's polite to reference that person, don't you? No shade. So My Policeman follows the story of Tom and Marion. So Tom is a young policeman in 1950s Brighton, and Marion is a young lady, a teacher that he meets. Marion very quickly falls in love with him, and then one day Tom meets a older gentleman who works at a museum called Patrick, and Patrick kind of opens up Tom's eyes to a whole another kind of side of the world that he'd never really experienced before. And he falls kind of head over heels in love with Patrick, and Patrick falls in love with Tom, and Marion is in love with Tom. And it's all very love triangle-y, but it's done in a really great way. The reason why I really liked this is it's much more than just a kind of coming out story. A lot of LGBTQ fiction focuses on the process of coming out, and that is a very important part of LGBT life, I suppose, is coming out. It's a very important part of it, but it's not all there is to an LGBTQ person's life. There is a lot more that surrounds it. That's just one part of it. And what I really enjoyed was the fact that this book explores so much more than just a coming out story. It explores people's reliance on other people, how it explores the lengths that people will go to for the people that they love. It obviously, as I said, it explores the idea of a love triangle and what happens when one of the kind of corners of that love triangle breaks, and it affects the other 2 in ways that you wouldn't imagine. So it's really this book I really enjoyed. Definitely pick it up if you're interested in this kind of thing. It's not a very long read, but it's a very enjoyable read, and really moving at parts, and yeah, it was really good. Really enjoyed that. So another book, one of the 2 books that I read in the month of May is the second book that Simon recommended on his channel, and that is From the Wreck by Jane Rawson. So this is a diddy little book. I think I read this in just a couple of sittings, which is rare for me. It usually takes me a while because I'm a very slow reader, hence 2 books in the month of May. But yeah, I really, really, really enjoyed this book. It was completely not what I was expecting. So I already had, because I'd seen Simon's videos, I already had an idea about what it was about. I understood some of the context behind it. I understood some of the themes that it kind of looked at. But the way it was written was completely not what I was expecting at all. And as I said, I really, really, really enjoyed it. But if you were to ask me why, I wouldn't be able to tell you, which is great for a booktube channel, isn't it? So I'll just sit here in silence holding up the book for the next couple of minutes, shall I? So it follows the story, I think it's set in the 1850s in Australia, and it follows the story of a gentleman who is shipwrecked on a ship just off the coast of Australia. And he was out at sea for a long while. I can't remember how long it says, 8 weeks or something like that, I can't remember. And during this time, he was accompanied by what he believed to be a kind of mythical creature woman, spirit type thing, who kept him alive. And throughout his life, he cannot shake the feeling that she's still around or that she's affecting his life, and he spends a lot of time trying to find her. It explores the effect that has on his relationship with his wife, especially with his older child, his oldest boy, and it was so well written. It's so really easy to read, and it explored a kind of time and place that I wasn't very familiar with. I love books set in the Victorian times, and I think the reason why I love books set in the Victorian times is because they usually focus on Victorian England or Victorian Britain, and that's especially kind of why I like Dickens, because it's the kind of gritty, grimy, sooty, Dickensian London that he describes, which is why I love it so much. But this was set in Victorian Australia, and it's just not a place or time that is written about a lot, I find anyway. So it's really interesting to be reading a book set in the Victorian times but was based in Australia. At times I found it quite hard to picture the places, but that didn't take away from my enjoyment of the book at all. One thing I really enjoyed about this book is that the fact that it kind of it follows mainly the voice of the gentleman who is shipwrecked and also his older son, but it also follows some other kind of extraordinary characters. A lady who has a daughter, and then that daughter grows up and has a child of her own, and then dumps that child on the grandmother, and her relationship with that child, how she's really kind of not interested in looking after the child at all, and she has no kind of maternal or grand maternal feelings towards it. That's a really kind of interesting concept that isn't really explored very much. So that was great. So the other voice in this book is the voice of the lady who is on the ship and who keeps the gentleman who is shipwrecked alive. This kind of spectre almost that follows him throughout his life. So a couple of chapters throughout the book are written from her point of view or through her voice, and they're incredibly literary, quite poetic at some points, and quite epic really when she talks about how she came to Earth and how her experience of time from the beginning of time and kind of exploring who she is and things like that. It was really jarring from the way that the other chapters are written, but not jarring in a bad way at all. Really complimentary of the way that the rest of the book was written. And it kind of reminded me in a way of the chapters written from the point of view of the mermaid in The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock. It's that same kind of voice, if you like. So yes, do pick this up. It's not at all what I was expecting, but I really loved it, and I'm so glad I read it, and I hope more people read this as well. So yes, From the Wreck by Jane Rawson, read it. So the other book that I picked up in May is, as I said before, is a kind of Victorian classic, and that is The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. This is maybe my 7th Charles Dickens novel. I did enjoy it, but I think it's absolutely not my favourite Charles Dickens novel for many different reasons. But my least favourite Charles Dickens novel is still like one of my all-time favourite novels in real life as well, because I just really like Charles Dickens. So The Old Curiosity Shop follows the story of a young girl around about the age of, I think, probably 11. Her name is Nell. And she lives in London in an old curiosity shop with her grandfather. So this old curiosity shop is like an antiques dealership, I imagine. Her grandfather is obsessed with the idea of keeping her in the manner of which she has become accustomed. So he's obsessed with the idea of providing for her in her future when he's not around anymore. So his driver is making money for her. This gets him inevitably into a lot of debt, because the way that he decides to make money for her is to go to the gambling tables. His creditors lose patience with him, and his creditor is a really villainous character called Mr. Quilp, and he is there's, as Katie says, Katie at Books and Things talks about in her videos on The Old Curiosity Shop, the character of Mr. Quilp is quite problematic in the sense that he is a villain, but he also has dwarfism. So, and the way that Charles Dickens writes that is that his villainous side and his dwarfism go hand in hand. They're both kind of synonymous with each other, which is quite problematic for someone reading it in this day and age. But yeah, despite that, Mr. Quilp is one of the best villains that I have encountered in any Dickens novel. He's so slimy and awful, and the way that he treats his wife is absolutely disgusting and actually quite hard to read sometimes. It's really, really not very nice. But anyway, back to Nell and her grandfather. So they decide to run away. Nell convinces her grandfather the best thing to do to escape the creditors is to run away, and that they would rather live a poor life travelling the countryside of England rather than face his creditors and the evilness of Mr. Quilp. So they go on this adventure throughout the countryside of England, and one of the things that I found really interesting about their journey is the kindness of the strangers that they meet. So obviously they don't have a penny to their name really, and the people that they meet help them, they provide for them, they help them work, they give them shelter. And these people aren't necessarily people, you know, lords and ladies of the English countryside with manor houses and lots of money to spare. They're just ordinary people who help Nell and her grandfather along their way. And I think that's really interesting, the way that Charles Dickens decides to make the characters that they meet not incredibly wealthy, not, you know, have lots of things to give to them, but despite that, they still help to provide for Nell and her grandfather. And that's really, really interesting. One of the biggest kind of themes throughout this book is the idea of addiction. So, as I said before, her grandfather goes to the gambling tables, and it becomes quite obvious quite early on that he is addicted to gambling. And the effect that this has on him is obviously devastating. And also the effect that it has on Nell as his kind of carer is really upsetting, really. You have this, you know, 11-year-old girl and her grandfather. The grandfather is the adult. He's supposed to be protecting her, but actually she's the one protecting him. And the sadness that she sees and the sadness that she experiences by not being able to stop him from gambling and not being able to help him is really quite moving, actually. So yes, that's another kind of theme that runs throughout this book. One of the things I found quite difficult with this book is that it follows that story, but it also follows another story of a young gentleman called Kit, and he and his kind of life back in London as he's waiting for Nell to return, and the things that he kind of goes through with Mr. Quilp and the Brass family, who are a brother and sister lawyer duo who are quite villainous as well, really. I feel that throughout the first kind of half of the book, it's split between those two storylines, Nell and her grandfather and Kit back at home. But then it spends way too long on Kit back at home, and then goes back to Nell and her grandfather quite abruptly at the end, it feels like it's a bit rushed, just to tie it up. And usually with Dickens, all of the different interweaving storylines come together at the end of the book into one amazing kind of culmination where everything ties together, but I didn't really feel like this did. I feel like we left Nell and her grandfather for too long towards the end of the book, and it didn't tie up very well for me, but I still really, really liked it. One of the things that I loved about this book is the writing in the last couple of chapters. So one of the things that Dickens does so well is the contrast between light and shade. There isn't a lot of light in this book, I'll be honest, but the shade is really moving at some points, and especially towards the end of these last couple of chapters. His writing reminds me of his best writing ever in the last couple of chapters. Something very moving happens, and the way that he writes the emotions of the characters is incredibly moving and really helped to I think this book for me was going to be a 3-star, but the last couple of chapters moved it up to a 4-star. The ending is not really a great happy ending. Sorry if that's a bit of a spoiler, but it's not. But the writing helps you to be able to process it and deal with it. So yes, The Old Curiosity Shop by old Charles Dickens, or Darl's Chickens as I like to call him. Bit of comedy there. Yeah, not my favourite Charles Dickens book. Actually, probably my least favourite, along with Little Dorrit. Sorry. But yeah, still absolutely worth a read. It's not one of his longest books. I think it's about 600 pages, something like that. So yes, if you're interested in this, do pick it up. So thanks for bearing with me throughout my my May wrap up. I will be back in a couple of days, hopefully, with another video. Don't know what it's going to be yet. Have to tune in and see. Okay, cheers. Thanks a lot. Bye.